The morning of September 14th, 1886, Britta Nyland stood at the edge of her 160-acre claim in Spink County, Dakota Territory, and tried to count what she had left. Her husband, Gunnar, was 3 weeks dead, thrown from a plough horse on a Tuesday afternoon in a rut no wider than her hand, and by Friday he was gone. By the following Wednesday, the in-laws had arrived from Redfield with a wagon and an opinion, and by Thursday they had taken the team, the plough, the cast-iron stove, the better ox, and the opinion that she could not possibly manage. They left her the claim shanty, $14, a half cord of cottonwood cut the previous March, and a single milk cow named Bjørnstjerne Gunnar had named her after a Norwegian poet and found that funny. Britta had never understood why. What the in-laws did not take what they couldn't legally take, because Dakota Territory's married women's property law had been slowly acquiring teeth since 1879, was the land itself. 160 acres of Spink County Prairie, filed under the Homestead Act with 3 years already proven. Britta was 26 years old, born in Telemark, Norway, widowed in Dakota Territory, and she had 2 years left before she could convert that claim to a deed. The shanty Gunnar had built in the spring of 1884 was a 14 by 16-foot box of rough-sawn lumber, shipped in on the Chicago and Northwestern line to Redfield, then hauled 12 miles out by wagon. It had board and batten siding 1 inch thick, a single layer of tar paper beneath it, and cracks along every joint where the green wood had dried and pulled apart. In cold weather, Britta had watched the flame on the kerosene lamp bend sideways when the northwest wind came in, as if a ghost were trying to blow it out. There was no insulation, there was no vestibule. There was a cast-iron parlour stove that the in-laws had taken, a door on the south side that faced the wagon road, and 2 small windows, one south, one west. The south-facing door was the conventional choice, and every settler built it that way. The wagon road ran east-west along the section line, and you put your door where people could find it, where the morning sun could hit it, where it announced to the township that you had a proper claim on a proper piece of ground. Britta spent 3 days thinking about that door. She had grown up in a farmhouse in Telemark where the door faced east, not south, not toward the road, but away from the prevailing wind that came down off the plateau in the winters. Her father had called it common sense. Her mother had called it how things were done. In Norway, nobody put their door on the windward wall. The concept had a name, vindfang, which translated roughly as wind catch, the small, unheated vestibule that every serious Norwegian farmhouse used to stop the cold from walking straight into the kitchen. You entered through one door, stood in a space barely large enough to stamp your feet and hang your coat, and then opened a second door into warmth. The wind never got through both. In Spink County, the wind that arrived in January didn't come from the south. It came from the northwest, exactly as it had come every January in recorded history, exactly as the Lakota had known before any settler had surveyed a section line. The worst cold in Dakota Territory arrived riding a northwest wind. Her door faced south. The northwest wind spent all winter hammering the blind back wall of her shanty, found the gaps in the board and batten, and let itself in through every crack it could reach. It also found the south-facing door in a very specific way. When the wind hit the north wall and wrapped around the structure, it created a low-pressure zone along the south wall that pulled air out of the cabin. Meanwhile, higher pressure on the north side pushed air through the cracks. The cabin breathed backward through its own gaps all winter, with cold air coming in everywhere and warm air going out the same way. Britta had not read ASHRAE standards. She had not studied building science. But she had spent 26 winters in buildings built by people who had thought carefully about which direction was going to try to kill you. She borrowed a hammer from the Strand family 2 miles east, spent 3 days dismantling the south-facing door assembly, framed a new rough opening on the east wall, and installed the door there. Then she used the lumber from the old door opening to frame up a lean-to vestibule on the east side, 6 feet deep, 8 feet wide, unheated. With a second salvage door she found in a pile of lumber scraps at the Redfield lumber yard and bought for 60 cents. She now had 2 doors with an unheated airlock between them. The east face caught morning sun, and the sun's angle in January at 45 degrees north latitude meant that east-facing surfaces got far less direct radiation than south-facing ones, but they also faced away from the prevailing winter storm track. Entirely. No northwest blizzard ever hit a wall head-on if that wall was pointing east. Wind coming from 315 degrees does not strike a 90-degree surface at full dynamic pressure. It glances, and the stagnation pressure that would have driven cold air through every south wall crack was no longer loading her primary entry. Then she did the second thing, the one that made the settlers talk. She stacked firewood against the north wall of the cabin, not beside it but hard against it, floor to eave, 2 rows deep, 4 feet of cottonwood rounds stacked flush against the boards. The Halvorsen brothers came by on their way to Redfield and stopped their wagon in the road to watch her do it. "That's a barn wall, not a house," said Nels Halvorsen. "She's going to burn the house down, setting fire to her own siding," said his brother Eric. She didn't answer. She had 43 feet of north wall and no money for a second skin of lumber, and she had just created something that 4 feet of dense stacked wood actually does. It catches a significant fraction of its own dead air, it adds mass to the windward surface, and it stops the wind from finding the north wall cracks at all. The wood was a wall in front of the wall. 4 feet of stacked cordwood has a measured R value of roughly R6 per foot, meaning she added approximately R24 of effective insulation to the single worst wall on a building with no insulation anywhere. She had 40 rounds left over and stacked them on the north side of the vestibule, knee-high, to form a windbreak for the entry approach. Ole Bernstein, who ran the general store in Frankfurt and fancied himself the local authority on winter construction, he had been in Spink County since 1879 and never froze, which he considered proof of his judgment, drove by on a Thursday afternoon while Britta was tamping sod against the base of the north and west walls. 2 feet of sod packed tight around the perimeter at ground level, which every old sod house builder on the plains knew would cut ground-level infiltration by more than half. Bernstein stopped his buggy and watched. "Mrs. Nyland," he said, "you have put your door on the wrong side of the house." "I moved it," she said, not stopping. "You can see why that's a mistake," he said. He had a way of speaking that assumed agreement. "South-facing doors catch the winter sun. Warm days, snow melts off the step. You can't get a warm day through an east door." She did not explain that the east door caught the early morning sun just fine, or that her first objective was not a warm step, but a living body inside the house. She said, "I know what I'm doing." "The wood against the north wall," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "That's dead fuel in a drift all winter. Come February, you'll be digging it out from under 4 feet of snow. Then I'll have 4 feet of snow insulating the wood that's insulating the wall," she said. Bernstein went quiet for a moment. Then, "The Halvorsens have a proper stove, German-made, solid iron. You'd be warmer paying them to let you board with them through January than spending all this time on," he gestured at the sod and the stacked wood, "whatever this is." Britta put down her sod tamping board and looked at him. "My mother's house in Telemark," she said, "had a door facing east and wood stacked on the windward wall and sod banked to the sill every November. It was built in 1741. It still stands. My grandfather lived to be 83 years old in it without ever boarding with the Halvorsens." She picked up her board again. Bernstein sat a moment longer, then flicked his reins and continued toward Frankfurt. In his defense, the Halvorsens' setup was formidable. They had a 2-room frame house with a proper German-made iron stove that they'd paid $38 to ship from Chicago, full chimney, glass in every window, and a woodpile against the south fence that went 6 feet high and 40 feet long. What Britta estimated was 6 or 7 cords, enough to heat most cabins through a normal winter. They'd been in Spink County 5 years. Their buildings showed it, and the sight of them comfortable and established made her own collection of modifications look like a gamble, which she knew it was. She spent October and into November working. She cut and hauled slough grass from the low area on the south edge of her claim and stuffed it into the cavity she'd created between the east lean-to wall and the old shanty siding. Loose slough grass has an R value of roughly R2 per inch, and she packed it 8 to 10 inches thick. The east wall of the vestibule became, without her framing it that way, an insulated wall with a measured equivalent R value somewhere around R18 to R20 inches, the packed grass. She drove 12 fence posts along the west wall and ran 3 horizontal rails between them, filling the 6-foot cavity with more loose slough grass. That was the west wall, dealt with, not sealed, not perfect, but dramatically better than bare board and batten against a January wind. She had no stove, because the in-laws had taken it. She had $14 and could not afford the $38 for a new Acme Queen or a German parlour heater. What she could afford, at $4.75, was a small sheet metal camp stove from the hardware store in Redfield that weighed 11 pounds and produced about 15,000 British thermal units per hour. When burning dry wood roughly half what a proper iron stove put out, and nothing like what a masonry heater could deliver. But sheet metal loses heat fast and iron loses it slowly, and what she needed was not a bigger fire but a better room, and she was going to get there through the envelope. She nailed 2 layers of cotton muslin to the inside of the north and west walls, leaving a 2-inch dead air gap between the fabric and the board. Dead air doesn't conduct, and it doesn't move unless something forces it. The muslin was cheap, 9 cents a yard at Bernstein's store, and the 3/4 inch to 2 inch of trapped still air that the fabric created against those 2 walls added an effective R value of roughly R3 to R5 for a total interior insulation cost of less than $2. She covered the floor with a double layer of prairie sod set grass down, and over that she laid the canvas tarpaulin that had been left in the lean-to, folded double. The earth under that canvas would stay above freezing all winter, as long as the room stayed heated. The frost line in Dakota Territory typically ran to 54 inches. But directly beneath a heated floor, the ground holds warmth that a bare board floor leaks to the outdoors. Her neighbour too claims north, Sigrid Amott, a Norwegian widow 3 years older than Britta, who had proved up her own claim in 1884, came by in early November to look at what Britta had done. She walked through the vestibule, tried both doors, pressed her hand against the inside of the north wall muslin, and looked up at the ceiling where Britta had tacked slough grass between the ceiling joists. "My husband would have called this a poor man's strategy," Sigrid said. "What would you call it?" Britta asked. "Smart," she said. Sigrid's own cabin was sod-banked on all 4 sides and had a 5-foot vestibule on the south face that her late husband had built from salvaged lumber. She'd added a second small window on the south wall after he died to let in more solar gain. She burned through roughly 2 cords of cottonwood between October and April in a mild year. The winter of 1886 to 87 was not mild. The storm that the Signal Corps station at Huron, Dakota Territory logged on the 15th of November 1886 was the first shot. Temperatures at Huron fell to -14 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, with sustained northwest winds at 28 miles per hour. Britta's camp stove ran all night on a 1/4 cord of cottonwood that she fed in small pieces. The sheet metal heater had no thermal mass to speak of, no ability to hold heat between loads, so she fed it every 2 hours through the night. She slept in her overcoat and wool stockings on a rope-sprung cot with Gunnar's Hudson Bay blanket and a sheepskin she'd borrowed from Sigrid. At 6 in the morning, before she opened the outer vestibule door, she checked the inside wall thermometer she'd hung on the south wall of the cabin. It read 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the outside thermometer, hung on the vestibule outer wall, read negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, 56 degrees of differential, maintained overnight on a camp stove fed by one person sleeping in 2-hour intervals. She went outside to get wood and found the north wall woodpile under 2 feet of drifted snow, exactly as old Bernstein had predicted. She also found that the snow had packed itself hard against the firewood and the firewood hard against the board siding, and that where she pressed her hand against the north wall siding from outside, the boards were noticeably warmer than the ambient air. The snowpack was doing what snow always does, with an R value of roughly R1 per inch. It had added another R24 of insulation to a wall that was already R24 inches firewood and R3 inches muslin trapped air. She had not planned this, though she had half expected it. She dug out an armful of wood from the top of the pile and went back inside. The Halvorsen brothers, with their German iron stove and their 7 cords of wood along the south fence, reported through the community grapevine that they had gotten through the November 15 storm, burning 3/4 of a cord in 2 days, while Britta had burned approximately half that amount with a smaller stove, a tighter room, and a door facing east. December 1886 brought a pattern of storms that the settlers in Spink County would talk about for the rest of their lives. The big die-up of the previous winter, 1885–86, had already killed enormous numbers of cattle on the eastern range. Theodore Roosevelt's herds in the Badlands took a 60% loss. The winter of 1886–87 killed even more. The temperature in Bismarck reached negative 43 degrees Fahrenheit in January. Fort Assiniboine recorded negative 55.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Fargo dropped to negative 48 degrees Fahrenheit. These were Signal Corps figures, recorded by trained observers at official stations, not the exaggerated numbers of letters home, but the actual, documented, verified temperatures of a winter that was trying to end the settlement of the northern Great Plains. In Spink County, the sustained cold came in 2 separate sieges. The first, December 20 through December 29, kept daytime temperatures at or below negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and nighttime temperatures ranging from negative 24 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit for 9 consecutive nights. The second, arriving January 8 through January 17, was worse. Negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit at Huron Signal Station, negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit at Millette, negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit recorded at Fort Buford to the northwest. Britta burned her way through these sieges by feeding the camp stove every 90 minutes at night, rather than every 2 hours, by keeping the vestibule door to the outside firmly latched, and by moving Björnstjerne the cow into the vestibule beginning December 22. This was not a comfortable arrangement. The vestibule was 6 feet by 8 feet and now contained one Norwegian widow whenever she was fetching wood or checking on the cow, and a full-grown dairy animal who smelled exactly as you would expect and who generated, according to the basic thermodynamics of bovine metabolism, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 British thermal units per hour of waste body heat. Not enough to heat a room, but enough in an unheated vestibule to keep the second door between the vestibule and the cabin from becoming a direct portal to the negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit outdoors every time she opened it. The vestibule, with Björnstjerne in it, stayed around 20 degrees Fahrenheit during the worst nights, cold enough to require a coat, but 48 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside. When Britta opened the inner door from the vestibule into the cabin, she was stepping from 20 degrees Fahrenheit air into 42 degrees Fahrenheit air. Not from negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit air into 42 degrees Fahrenheit air. The difference in heat loss is not trivial. Opening a door from negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit into a 60 degrees Fahrenheit room, the temperature she was trying to maintain exchanges an enormous volume of air that requires substantial fuel to reheat. Opening a door from 20 degrees Fahrenheit into 60 degrees Fahrenheit exchanges air that requires roughly 40% less energy to bring back to temperature. Bjørnstjerne, inadvertently, was a heat buffer. Ole Bernstein, when he heard about the cow in the vestibule from the Halvorsens, said it was the most Norwegian thing he had ever heard of, and suggested that Britta might as well have built a longhouse, which he said without meaning it as a compliment. He was not entirely wrong that it was Norwegian. In Telemark, the longhouse tradition, humans and animals sharing connected structures, each warming the other's half, was old enough to be mentioned in saga literature. Britta's parents had kept 2 goats in an attached shed that shared a wall with the kitchen. The shared wall leaked heat in both directions, and her parents had thought of it as a reasonable arrangement, while Bernstein, from his frame house with his German stove and his full wood pile, thought of it as evidence of a problem. He was burning wood at a rate Britta was tracking through community gossip with something close to scientific interest. By January 5, the Halvorsens had gone through 4 of their 7 cords better than 2 cords per month in the December cold. If the January siege proved as long as it looked, they would need to buy more. Wood cost $4 to $6 per cord delivered to Spink County when it was available at all, and the Frankfurt woodyard had sold out twice already. Britta had gone through roughly 1 3/4 cords. She'd started with half a cord from Gunnar's cutting and had spent $6 in September to buy another full cord from a Norwegian family named Brekke, who'd abandoned their claim and needed cash 1 1/2 cords, total, of which she'd used approximately 1 1/4, leaving her a 1/4 cord in the north wall stack and another 1/4 in the lean-to. She was going to run short before April, and the question was by how much, and what she would burn instead. On January 9, with the second cold siege settling in the sky, the particular yellow-grey colour that the long-timers in Spink County associated with sustained cold rather than snow, Britta walked to Sigrid Amot's claim and spent the afternoon cutting sloof grass from the frozen marsh on the north edge of Sigrid's property. Sloof grass, twisted tight and bent back on itself, burns hot for approximately 90 seconds per bundle before collapsing into ash. Laura Ingalls Wilder's family, living in De Smet in Kingsbury County directly to the south during the hard winter of 1880–81, twisted hay every day all winter just to keep up with their small stove's consumption. It was the most labour-intensive way to make fuel that most people could think of, and it was also free, and Britta had no alternative. She brought back 2 burlap sacks of grass and started twisting that evening, sitting close to the camp stove, feeding it twisted grass bundles every 10 to 12 minutes during the day to supplement the wood she burned at night. She could produce a bundle every 3 minutes when she worked steadily, which meant she was effectively trading 20 minutes of her hour for the equivalent heat of 1 piece of firewood, and her hands were raw by the 2nd week of January. The 12th of January, 1888, was the date that everyone in Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota would eventually know by a specific name. But in January of 1887, 1 year before the famous disaster, she was simply surviving a siege that the newspapers would record, but that history would largely forget, overshadowed by what came the following January. The January 1887 cold in Spink County was real. The Bismarck Tribune of the 14th of January, 1887, recorded temperatures below 0 daily since January 8, with Bismarck reaching -43 on the night of the 10th. Cattle on open range across Montana and Dakota were dying by the thousands, and that winter, not the following one, was the one that killed the open range cattle industry. Theodore Roosevelt came back from his Badlands ranch in spring 1887 to find his herd nearly gone 60% dead by his own accounting, which he described as the end of his interest in ranching and, some biographers have argued, the beginning of his interest in conservation. Britta Nyland got through January 1887 by burning her remaining quarter cord of cottonwood, approximately 40 pounds of twisted slough grass, 14 dried cow chips from a bag she'd collected from the open range in October, and the heat of one dairy cow standing in an enclosed vestibule. Her inside wall thermometer never dropped below 32 degrees Fahrenheit through January. The Halversons finished their 7th cord on January 19th, when the worst of the cold was still holding at negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Nels Halvorsen drove his wagon to Frankfurt looking for more wood and came back with half a cord of green cottonwood at $8, nearly double the full price, because the yard was nearly out. Green cottonwood burns at roughly 65% the efficiency of seasoned wood, which means the half cord gave them about a third of a cord's worth of useful heat. On January 20th, Nels Halvorsen knocked on Britta's outer vestibule door, stepped into the vestibule, startled by the cow, then not, and then through the inner door into the cabin. She had coffee on the camp stove and poured him a cup, and he held it in both hands for a long time before saying anything. "How much wood do you have left?" he asked. "Enough," she said. He looked at the north wall muslin, at the sod floor with its canvas cover, at the camp stove that was, he could see, genuinely smaller than what most people would attempt to heat with, though the cabin was only 224 square feet. He'd been thinking of his own house's dimensions and mentally applying them to hers. "We need to buy wood," he said. "What Bernstein has left, he's charging $9 a cord. How much do you need?" 2 cords to get through February. Nels Halvorsen had the money. 5 years in Spink County had given him enough reserves that $18 would not break him. But he was sitting in a woman's cabin that he had watched all fall with something between skepticism and contempt, asking for information about wood supply. "There's a family named Lavick about 4 miles north on Section 14, Britta said. "They're going back to Wisconsin in the spring. They have maybe 3 cords cut, and they need money for the train tickets. I imagine they'd sell at full prices." She knew this because Sigrid Amott had told her, and Sigrid knew everything about who in Spink County was staying and who was leaving because she paid attention. Nels Halvorsen bought 2 cords from the Lavick family at $4.50 each and got through February without further crisis. He did not apologize to Britta. He did not acknowledge that her door facing east or her wood stacked against the north wall had any connection to the difference in their fuel consumption, but he also never called her modifications foolish again. And when his neighbour Anders Grundvåg arrived on a land claim 2 sections west in the spring of 1887 and asked Nels which way to face his door, Nels told him east and gave no reason. The winter of 1886–87 ended, and the spring of 1887 brought something Britta had not expected to feel, a version of permanence. She had survived a winter that had killed cattle by the hundreds of thousands across the territory, that had broken the open-range cattle industry within a season, that had pushed dozens of Spink County homesteaders to abandon their claims and go back to wherever they'd come from. She had survived it, burning approximately half what the Halversons had burned, in a smaller stove, with a modified cabin that cost her an additional $11.35 in lumber, muslin and fence posts, plus the labour of her own hands. In the summer of 1887 she made 3 more changes. She cut the east vestibule deeper, adding 2 more feet, so it ran 8 feet from outer door to inner door. She added a south-facing window to the main cabin, just one small one, because Sigrid had been right that south glass in January could add meaningful solar gain on clear days at 45 degrees north latitude. A south-facing vertical pane of glass on a clear January afternoon intercepts around 1,500 British thermal units per day per square foot, a number that matters when your stove only produces 15,000 British thermal units per hour, meaning every hour of strong January sun through that window was roughly equivalent to 6 minutes of stove burning. She also added a third layer to the north wall firewood stack, not a third row of rounds, but a row of flat-stacked split pieces fitted tight against the rounds, which reduced the air gaps between pieces and increased the effective density. By October 1887, her neighbours' attitude toward her cabin had shifted from mockery toward curiosity, toward something approaching respect, though nobody quite said so. The Halversons had their own sod banking by October 1887. Anders Grundtvig had put his door on the east face. The Brecky family's replacement on that claim, newcomers from Minnesota named Carlson, came by in early November and asked Britta directly how she had decided where to put her door, and she walked them through the logic in the plainest terms she knew. The worst wind comes from the northwest. The door on the south catches that wind as it wraps around the building. The east door faces away from it entirely. The vestibule stops whatever wind does reach the entry from getting through. If you also bank sod against the base and stack something with thermal mass against the windward wall, you have cut your fuel consumption in a bad winter by half or more. The Carlsons built their vestibule that October. In January 1888, the weather arrived that would give everyone who survived it a name for what they'd been through. The morning of the 12th of January 1888 started at approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit across most of Dakota Territory, a January thaw, one of those false spring mornings that the Prairie threw out like a trap. Children went to school in Kingsbury County, 20 miles south of Spink, without their heaviest coats. In Huron, at the signal station, the morning reading at 7 a.m. was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 hours later, it was 14 degrees Fahrenheit. By 10 p.m., it was negative 17 degrees Fahrenheit. By 2 of the 13th, it had reached negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit. At Yankton, Dakota Territory, which was south and east and should have been more protected, the temperature dropped 18 degrees Fahrenheit in 3 minutes when the front arrived, and people who stepped outside to check on the animals didn't make it back in. Children who had been dismissed from school during the brief warm morning were caught in the open when the wall of cold hit. The estimate of deaths from this one storm, the storm that would become known as the Schoolhouse blizzard, runs from 235, which was the count the Signal Corps eventually settled on, to somewhere near 500 by modern reckonings that include delayed deaths and victims who weren't initially counted. In Kingsbury County, directly south of Spink, Minnie Mae Freeman, 19 years old, teaching at the Midvale Schoolhouse in Mira Valley, led 13 children a half-mile through zero visibility and deteriorating temperature after the wind tore the door and part of the roof off her schoolhouse. All 13 survived. She told the newspapers afterward, with a directness that the reporters seemed to find surprising. She had not led the children toward her own boarding house, but toward the nearest structure with a sheltered entry, because she didn't think she could make it the full quarter mile with the smallest children in tow. In nearby Pierce County, a teacher named Lois May Royce tried to lead 3 students less than 75 meters through the open from her school to her boarding house. All 3 children froze in her arms. She survived with both feet amputated. The difference between Minnie Freeman and Lois Royce was not courage, both were brave. It was the difference between a short sheltered route and a slightly longer unsheltered one. 75 meters of open ground in a negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard with 4-5 mile per hour winds killed 3 children who walked it, while half a mile with adequate shelter markers and a group moving together survived. The same physics was playing out inside every building in Spink County on the night of January 12th. A standard 1-inch board and batten shanty facing south, the kind that most first-year homesteaders built, had no thermal mass, no insulation, and a primary entry directly in the wind's path as it wrapped around the structure. The wind pressure on a south-facing wall during a northwest blizzard at 45 miles per hour is modest in terms of direct loading. The south wall is the lee wall during a northwest storm, not the windward wall. But that lee wall, low pressure, acts like a pump, pulling cold air through every crack in the north and west walls, through every gap between siding boards, through the floor joints, through the space around the stovepipe collar. The cabin breathes in through the windward gaps and out through the lee, creating a continuous low-velocity infiltration of negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit air across every surface in the room. At negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit outside and a firebox burning full, a standard 1880s claim shanty might maintain 30 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze food stored in corners, cold enough to cause chilblains if you slept against the wall, warm enough to avoid dying if you stayed close to the stove and kept it fed. But the stove feeding was the problem. Every load of wood required opening a door to get it, and with a windward door or a south door that the chimney draft was already pulling cold air through every entry was a cold event. In Britta's cabin, the chain worked differently. She went out to get wood through the inner door into the vestibule, which was at 22 degrees Fahrenheit, because Bjørnstjerne was still in there for the same reason as the previous January. She pulled the inner door shut, stood in the vestibule for 10 seconds, pulled wood from the pile she'd moved into the vestibule, and came back through the inner door. The cabin interior saw a brief drop from 52 degrees Fahrenheit to perhaps 46 degrees Fahrenheit when she opened the inner door, and the camp stove, fed continuously, brought it back in 15 minutes. The Halvorsens' cabin, with their iron stove and their now diminished woodpile, they'd started the winter with what they thought was sufficient stock after the experience of the previous year. But January 12th was a different animal. Held at approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst of the night when Nels was trying to sleep between wood runs. He came to Britta's door at 7 a.m. on January 13th, not to ask for wood, but just, she thought, to see if she was still alive. He stood in the vestibule, and she opened the inner door, and he felt the warm air and said nothing for a moment. 28, he said, which she understood as the temperature inside his cabin. 52, she said. He went back home. Later that day, when the temperature outside had climbed to negative 8 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind dropped, he walked to Frankfurt and bought the last cord of wood Bernstein had in his yard. Britta made it through January 12th and 13th without opening her outside vestibule door at all. She had carried enough wood into the vestibule the previous afternoon when she'd seen the sky turn the particular yellow-grey that she now associated with serious cold, that she didn't need to go outside for 32 hours. She burned just over a third of a cord in those 32 hours. And her total wood consumption for the winter of 1,887 to 88, which ran from October through the last hard frost in late April, was 2 1/4 cords of cottonwood and willow, supplemented by approximately 60 pounds of twisted slough grass from the marsh on Sigrid's claim. Nels Halvorsen, with the German iron stove that was objectively a better heat source than her camp stove, burned more than 6 cords. His wife Ingeborg did the math that spring, sitting in Britta's cabin in April while the snow came off the prairie and Bjørnstjerne was back outside where she belonged. Ingeborg Halvorsen was a practical woman who tracked her household expenses in a ledger, and she knew exactly what they'd spent on wood that winter because she'd written it down, $32.50, including the emergency Frankfurt purchases and the Lavik wood. Britta had spent $9 on wood purchased in the fall, and nothing after that. 2 cords, Ingeborg said. 2.25, Britta said. How? Britta walked her through it. The east-facing door and what it did to infiltration pressure, the vestibule and what it did to the temperature gradient at the primary entry, the north wall woodpile and what stacking 4 feet of dense material against the windward boards did to the wall's effective resistance to wind penetration, the muslin and the trapped dead air, which doesn't conduct heat, because heat only moves through air efficiently when the air moves still air is close to inert as a thermal conductor, which is why fur and feathers and hollow grasses can insulate despite being mostly space. The sod banking at the perimeter, which stopped ground-level infiltration, and finally, the cow which Ingeborg thought was where the story crossed from ingenuity into eccentricity, but which Britta explained in terms of vestibule buffer temperature and the cost of reheating cold air, and which Ingeborg eventually admitted made a certain amount of sense. My husband's grandfather in Telemark, Britta said, kept 2 goats in the entry room all winter. The entry room was cold, the kitchen was warm, the wall between them leaked heat in both directions. In 40 years of winters, nobody in that house froze. This is not Telemark, Ingeborg said. No, Britta agreed. But the wind still comes from the northwest, and doors still let cold air in. By the spring of 1888, Britta Nyland was in her 5th year of proving up on her claim, with 1 year remaining before she could file for title. She had survived 2 brutal winters, the second including the worst single-day weather event that would hit the northern Great Plains for decades. She had done it burning approximately half to 2/3 of what her nearest neighbours burned, in a smaller stove, with modifications that had cost her less than $12 in materials. Ole Bernstein, who had watched her move the door and stack the wood that first September with the patient certainty that she was wrong, came to see her that spring. He didn't quite announce that he was there to learn something. He came under the pretext of asking whether she had any cottonwood saplings to sell, since she'd planted a shelter belt on the east edge of her claim the previous fall. But he spent an hour walking around the cabin, looking at the vestibule, looking at the north wall woodpile, pressing his hand against the inside of the north wall muslin the way Sigrid Amott had done 2 years earlier. The dead air behind the fabric, he said. That's the same principle as the air between 2 panes of glass. Yes, she said. I always wondered why double-glazed windows cost so much less to heat through than single glass. Because the glass isn't insulating anything, she said. The glass just holds the air still. He nodded slowly. He was the kind of man who, once he understood something, felt no particular need to acknowledge that he had not understood it before. He asked her 3 or 4 more questions about the vestibule dimensions and the sod banking depth and the north wall stack configuration, then bought 2 cottonwood saplings for 15 cents each and drove his buggy back toward Frankfurt. The following October, his store had a new addition on the north side, a lean-to vestibule 6 feet deep with 2 doors. Britta Nyland filed for title on her 160 acres of Spink County land in the fall of 1888. The prove-up documentation is in the records of the Redfield Land Office, in the collection now held by the South Dakota State Historical Society. Her witness testimony lists the improvements she had made: a 14 by 16 frame dwelling, an 8-foot vestibule addition, a well, a garden plot of 2 acres, and 7 acres broken to field. Gunnar had broken 4 of those 7 before he died, and Britta had broken 3 herself with a borrowed horse and a rented plough in the spring of 1887, working land that was supposed to be too hard for one person to work alone. She married again in 1891, a Swedish farmer named Lars Eriksson, who had his own claim 5 miles north, whose first wife had died of fever in 1889. He moved into her cabin. She kept the door facing east, and he thought the vestibule was the best thing he'd ever seen on a Dakota claim, and built one on his own abandoned shanty the following spring so they could use it for storage. In 1892, Lars built them a proper house, a 2-story frame structure, which had become affordable now that the Chicago and Northwestern and the Northwestern Railroad lines had made lumber more accessible and more competitive. He framed the new house with the east-facing entry Britta had insisted on, with a proper 8-foot vestibule inside the frame, and with sod banked against the north and west perimeters to the windowsill level each November. The new house had a proper parlour heater, cast iron, that weighed 340 pounds and held heat between loads, a significant improvement over the camp stove. They burned 3 cords through the winter of 1892–93, a normal winter and not an extreme one, in a house twice the size of the original shanty with a better stove. The Halverson brothers, by then in a similar-sized frame house with a similar stove, burned 5. There is a principle that underlies all of this, a principle that Britta Nyland understood from her father's house in Telemark, that the Lakota and Dakota people understood from their tippies, that the Mandan understood from their earth lodges, that every Norwegian farmhouse builder understood from the Vindfang vestibule, and that modern building scientists arrived at through measurement rather than tradition. The principle is simply this. Cold air doesn't just leak in, it is driven in. Wind pressure drives it. Stack effect drives it. The difference in density between cold and warm air drives it. Any opening, any gap, any thin spot in an envelope is an opportunity for those driving forces to move heat from inside to outside. The Plains tribes oriented their tipi openings east as a near-universal practice across dozens of distinct nations, and the reason is the same reason Britta moved her door. The worst cold on the northern plains arrives from the northwest, and you don't put your primary entry on the windward side of your structure. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and Blackfeet all knew this. Their tipis leaned slightly into the prevailing westerly wind. The base shape was intentionally oval rather than circular, with the shallow end toward the east, and the smoke flap at the top was designed to control the chimney effect and prevent the tent from acting as a cold air pump. A teepee in a January blizzard, properly pitched and oriented, could maintain a temperature differential of 40 to 60 degrees between inside and outside on a small central fire. Settlers who had never asked an indigenous person how they managed their winters built their shanties perpendicular to the section lines and then wondered why they froze. The Mandan and Hidatsa earth lodges took the same orientation principle and buried it in mass. Their entry passages ran 15 feet long in some cases, facing east or south, with a wooden screen inside the entry to stop wind that made it through the passage. The earth itself, 4 to 6 feet thick over the roof, maintained the interior temperature through pure thermal mass, the same way a cave stays near 55 degrees year-round, regardless of surface conditions. The earth does not conduct heat quickly. It stores heat and releases it slowly, and the deep ground stays above freezing because the earth's own geothermal warmth, bleeding slowly upward from far below, never quite lets the cold reach it. Britta's cabin was not a Mandan earth lodge, but the physics were not entirely different. She had put mass on her windward wall. She had created an air buffer at her primary entry. She had stopped the worst infiltration, and she had heated a small volume rather than a large one. The camp stove she couldn't afford to replace had actually been part of the solution in a way she didn't fully recognize until later. A small stove heating a well-sealed small space is more efficient than a large stove heating a leaky large one, because every BTU that leaves through a crack in the envelope is a BTU that has to be replaced. And a camp stove puts its BTUs directly into the air it can reach, rather than up a chimney. When modern building scientists began developing what would eventually become passive house standards in the 1970s and 1980s, they were working from measurements taken with instruments that Britta Nyland never had. They discovered with blower doors and heat flow meters and computerized energy models that the single largest source of heat loss in most buildings is not poor insulation in the walls, it is air leakage. A building that is tightly sealed at R12 outperforms a building insulated to R30 with poor air sealing. The infiltration of cold air is not a secondary problem, it is often the primary one. The passive house researchers also discovered that building orientation matters. A south-facing wall at 44 degrees north latitude receives approximately 1,500 British thermal units per square foot per day of solar energy in January. The north-facing wall of the same building receives perhaps 100 British thermal units per square foot, 1/15 as much. And over the course of a Dakota winter, that difference compounds into the equivalent of half a cord of wood or more, just from choosing which wall to face toward the sun. Britta chose the east wall for her door because it faced away from the storm track, not because she was optimizing her solar gain. But the south window, she added in 1887, the small one, the one Sigrid had suggested was solar gain, deliberately captured, because she had watched the afternoon sunlight move across her south wall and understood without instruments that it was warmer there than anywhere else on her cabin exterior in January, and that warmth going into a wall rather than out of it was something she wanted more of. The settlers who mocked her modifications were not fools. A south-facing door is sensible in a temperate climate with mild winters. The problem was that Spink County, Dakota Territory, in January 1887 and January 1888 was not a temperate climate. It was a zone of extreme weather, arriving from a specific direction at a specific time of year, and the people who had built their structures without regard to that direction paid for the oversight in firewood. Britta paid less not because she was luckier, but because she had grown up in a place where people had worked out, over centuries and through hard experience, which direction was going to try to kill you in January. She carried that knowledge across an ocean, filed a homestead claim, and built it into a 14 by 16 foot frame shanty in Spink County, Dakota Territory, with a borrowed hammer, $11.35 worth of lumber and muslin, and the conviction that her father's house had not survived 145 Norwegian winters by accident. The proof of concept from her first 2 winters made its way through the small communities of Norwegian-descended homesteaders in Spink County through a combination of practical demonstration and conversation. By 1890, the vestibule addition was common enough in the Norwegian-settled townships around Frankfurt and Tulare that it had a local name. Some families called it the Vindfang, keeping the Norwegian term. Others called it the cold room or the mud room or simply the entry. The sod banking was even more common because it was cheap and the benefit was obvious. The north wall mass strategy, the firewood stacked against the windward siding, was the least widely adopted, partly because it required having a surplus of wood to begin with, and partly because it looked unconventional in a way that the other modifications did not. But the orientation choice door on the east or southeast, blind wall to the northwest, spread fastest of all because it cost nothing and could be incorporated into any new building during framing before a single board was nailed. By 1892, the advice circulating in the Norwegian Lutheran congregations of Nordland Township and Lake Preston was consistent. If you are building new, face east. If you have built south, add a vestibule and bank sod against the north. And if you can do nothing else, at least stop the wind from finding your door. Britta Nyland Eriksson proved up her claim in 1888, married Lars Eriksson in 1891, and farmed the same 160 acres until 1917, when she sold to a neighbour's son and moved with Lars to Redfield. She died in Redfield in 1929, at 69 years old. The Spink County Register of Deeds has her name on the 1,888 title filing. The 1,900 census has her name, Lars's name, and 2 children, a daughter, Astrid, born 1893, and a son, Gunnar, born 1895, named for the first husband she had buried in September 1886. The frame house Lars built in 1892 with the east-facing door and the proper iron stove stood on that claim until 1947, when it was torn down to make room for a machine shed. By then, nobody in the neighbourhood remembered why the door faced east. But any building scientist reading the old plans would have recognised what she had known in 1886, when the cold comes from the northwest. The door goes on the east wall. The physics hasn't changed.